In the grand, violent theater of the 15th century, thrones weren't just inherited. They were taken and held, with steel, with cunning, and with a will of unbreakable iron. Imagine an England exhausted, demoralized, bleeding from the slow, painful loss of its territories in France. It was a kingdom teetering on a knife's edge. Its people, crushed by the weight of endless wars and crippling taxes, were desperate for a strong leader, a steady hand to guide them out of the darkness. What they had was King Henry VI, a man more suited to a quiet monastery than a cutthroat monarchy, a ruler whose saintly piety was matched only by his political incompetence. And as the shadows of civil war began to stretch across the land, the king's mind, already a fragile thing, started to shatter, threatening to plunge the entire realm into a crisis that would tear it apart from the inside out. But this isn't his story. This is the story of the woman who stepped into the void he left behind. Where the king faltered, the queen rose. A French princess who arrived as a symbol of peace, but would become one of the most formidable, hated, and misunderstood women in all of English history. While King Henry VI of England drifted into a silent world of madness, his queen, Margaret of Anjou, a teenager from France, seized the reins of power. She didn't just advise, she commanded armies, she forged treacherous alliances, and she fought with a ruthlessness that shocked even her most hardened enemies. All of it, she claimed, was to protect her son's inheritance. Her enemies gave her a name that would echo through history: the she-wolf of France, a foreign usurper, an adulterous monster. But was she the villain they claimed? Or was she a queen, a wife, a mother, simply doing what was necessary to save her family and her kingdom from falling into the abyss? This is the story of the queen who ruled her Mad King's War. And it's a story that will force you to question everything you think you know about heroes and villains. Margaret of Anjou was born on March 23, 1430, into a world of glittering titles and hollow crowns. Her father was René, Duke of Anjou, a man so cultured and romantic he was known as Good King René. He held the grand titles of King of Naples and Jerusalem, yet ruled almost none of them. He was a poet, a dreamer, a patron of the arts, a man of culture, not of conquest. But the women in Margaret's life were forged from a much harder, colder metal. Her paternal grandmother, the legendary Yolande of Aragon, was a political titan who had governed Anjou as regent, stared down English armies without flinching, and championed the cause of the French Dauphin when all seemed lost. Her own mother, Isabella of Lorraine, was no less formidable. When Margaret's father was taken prisoner, Isabella didn't just weep and wait. She took up arms, ruled as regent in his stead, and fought to defend their lands with a ferocity that her young daughter was watching and learning from every single day. Raised in this crucible of powerful female agency, Margaret learned a vital lesson early on. Power wasn't a birthright to be passively enjoyed, but a force to be actively, ruthlessly wielded. In 1444, this girl of just 15, described by those who met her as beautiful, passionate and proud and strong-willed, became the most valuable pawn in the great game between two weary nations. England and France were finally limping toward the end of the devastating 100 Years' War. A truce was not just wanted, it was desperately needed. The marriage of Margaret of Anjou to King Henry VI of England was meant to be the seal on that fragile peace. The arrangement, brokered by the English Duke of Suffolk, was controversial from the very beginning. For a royal bride, Margaret came with no dowry, a fact that raised more than a few eyebrows in the English court. But the real poison in the deal was something far worse. As part of the marriage treaty, England agreed to surrender the vast and strategically vital territories of Maine and Anjou to Margaret's father. While some modern historians question whether this was a formal secret clause or a later political invention, the result was the same: the lands were ceded. To many in England, it was a humiliating price to pay for a truce that felt more like a defeat. On April 22, 1445, Margaret of Anjou, just 15 years old, married the 23-year-old Henry VI at Titchfield Abbey. A month later, when she was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey, she was presented to the English people as the Bride of Peace, a beautiful, living symbol of hope and reconciliation. But behind the cheering crowds and lavish pageantry, a darker sentiment festered. For many, this French queen was a walking, talking reminder of their nation's losses, a beautiful face masking a bitter political pill. She had arrived in a kingdom that was spiritually broken, financially bankrupt, and simmering with a deep, dangerous discontent that was about to boil over into open war. The man Margaret had bound her life to was unlike any other king in Europe. Henry VI was the ghost of his father, the legendary warrior king Henry V. Where his father had been decisive and commanding, Henry was hesitant and easily manipulated. Where his father was a man of action who lived for the battlefield, Henry was a man of prayer, far more interested in his religious devotions and his grand educational projects, like the founding of Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, than in the grim, dirty business of governing a kingdom. He was gentle, kind, and profoundly, tragically unsuited to the brutal, backstabbing politics of his age. He was a king who loathed war and bloodshed, yet his reign would become one of the bloodiest in the entire, violent history of England. Margaret, vibrant, intelligent, and politically sharp, found herself dropped into a court that was a seething viper's nest of factions and conspiracies. The air was thick with resentment and intrigue, and it all swirled around one towering, unavoidable figure, Richard, Duke of York. York wasn't just any nobleman. He was the wealthiest and most powerful man in the entire realm. And crucially, he possessed a dangerously strong claim to the throne himself, tracing his lineage back to Edward III through a line that many considered superior to Henry's own Lancastrian bloodline. York and his powerful allies, particularly the formidable Neville family, saw the king's inner circle. Men like the Duke of Suffolk, who had arranged Margaret's marriage, and later, the Duke of Somerset, as corrupt, incompetent, and directly to blame for the humiliating string of losses in France. They positioned themselves as reformers, patriots trying to save England from itself. Margaret, naturally, saw things very differently. She aligned herself with her husband's allies, the men who had brought her to England. She looked at the Duke of York and didn't see a reformer. She saw a mortal threat. She saw a man whose ambition, she believed, wasn't just to reform the government, but to tear the crown from her husband's head. For the first few years, the Queen's role was largely conventional. She managed her estates, patronized religious houses, and in 1448, she became the patron and co-foundress of Queen's College, Cambridge, which had been initially established by Andrew Dockett. But her primary, most essential duty, the one on which the entire future of the Lancastrian dynasty depended, remained agonizingly unfulfilled. For 8 long, anxious years, the royal marriage was childless. With every passing month, every passing year, the threat of the Duke of York, the alternative king, grew larger. The kingdom held its breath, whispering and waiting for an heir. And when the news finally came, it arrived at the absolute worst moment imaginable. In the summer of 1453, as the devastating news arrived of the final, crushing loss of English territories in France, something inside King Henry's mind simply snapped. While staying at a royal hunting lodge, the king was suddenly smitten with a frenzy and his wit and reason withdrawn. It wasn't just a moment of melancholy. It was a complete and terrifying mental collapse. He was left in a catatonic state, a living statue, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to even recognize the people who stood before him. He would just stare, blankly, into a space no one else could see, utterly lost to the world. This deeply personal tragedy was a political catastrophe of the highest possible order. The kingdom was rudderless, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. And it was at this exact moment of crisis that Queen Margaret, after 8 years of silent prayers and public pressure, was finally pregnant. On October 13, 1453, she gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster. The birth of a male heir should have been a moment of ultimate triumph, the long-awaited answer to a nation's prayers, securing the Lancastrian line for another generation. Instead, it was completely overshadowed by the king's terrifying, silent illness. And in the vacuum of power, insidious whispers began to circulate. Given the timing, given the king's vacant condition, rumors, almost certainly planted and spread by Yorkist propagandists, began to question the prince's legitimacy, suggesting he was the product of an affair. The scene that followed is heartbreaking. When the infant prince, the future of England, was presented to his father, the king showed no flicker of recognition. He stared right through his own son, as if he were nothing but thin air. The queen, her heart surely breaking, held the child in her arms, pleading with Henry, begging him to at least bless their son. There was only silence. The realm now faced an unthinkable reality, an infant heir whose legitimacy was being openly questioned, and a king who was, for all intents and purposes, gone. The power vacuum he left behind was immense, a gaping wound in the heart of the kingdom. And into that void, two figures were preparing to step, ready to fight for control. The ever-ambitious Duke of York and the now fiercely, desperately protective mother, Queen Margaret. The stage was set for a conflict that would drown England in blood. With the king incapacitated, the government of England ground to a halt. A decision had to be made about who would rule. Margaret, now a mother, fiercely protective of her newborn son's rights, made a bold and unprecedented bid for power. She didn't just want influence. Sources suggest she sought to be named Regent of England. It was a shocking move for a queen consort, especially a French one, and the male-dominated council of English noblemen was having none of it. They swiftly rejected her ambitions. Instead, in March 1454, they turned to the one man Margaret feared and detested above all others, Richard, Duke of York. He was named Lord Protector of the realm. For Margaret, this was not just a political setback. It was a declaration of war on her son's future. She was utterly convinced that York's ultimate goal was not to protect the realm, but to steal the crown for himself. From this moment forward, any softness in her, any hope of being the bride of peace, evaporated. Her life crystallized into a single, all-consuming objective: to secure the throne for her son, Edward, no matter the cost. The gentle girl was gone. In her place, a political warrior was beginning to emerge. As protector, York acted swiftly and decisively. He had his chief rival, the Duke of Somerset, a key ally of the Queen, arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. He purged the government of his enemies and filled it with his own supporters. Margaret was ruthlessly sidelined, politically isolated, and all but exiled to Windsor with the insulting suggestion that her proper place was in the nursery with her child. For over a year, she was forced to watch, powerless, as her greatest enemy ruled England in her husband's name. Her own future, and that of her son, hung by the most slender of threads. She spent her days in a state of high anxiety, knowing that at any moment, York could make a move to depose her husband and make his own power permanent. And then, on Christmas Day 1454, something incredible happened. A miracle. King Henry woke up. His mind, which had been lost for so long in a dense, impenetrable fog, suddenly cleared. He was lucid. He recognized his wife. And, upon seeing his son for the very first time with clear eyes, he declared him to be his true and legitimate heir, finally silencing the vicious rumors. The king was back, and with him, so was the queen, and she was ready for a reckoning. Margaret wasted no time. With Henry once again nominally in control, though still easily influenced by his formidable wife, she moved with breathtaking speed and ruthlessness to undo everything York had done. The Duke of Somerset was immediately released from the Tower and restored to his former position of power. York's appointments were all reversed. His protectorate was officially terminated, and he was once again cast out into the political wilderness. The Queen was now, undeniably, the power behind the throne, and she seemed determined to crush the Yorkist threat once and for all. The breaking point, the moment of no return, came in May 1455. Margaret, exercising her complete influence over the king, called for a great council to be held at Leicester, deep in Lancastrian-held territory. Conspicuously and very deliberately, Richard, Duke of York, and his most important allies, the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick, were not invited. It was a calculated, aggressive, and deeply provocative move. It was a clear signal that the Yorkists were not just out of favor, they were being cast out, declared enemies of the state. It was the spark that would finally light the flame. York and his allies refused to be cornered and walk into what they saw as a trap. Instead of traveling to Leicester to face a council composed entirely of their enemies, they did something else. They gathered their own army. They claimed they were merely seeking to present their grievances to the king and to free him from his evil advisors, namely the Duke of Somerset. On May 22, 1455, the two forces met just outside the small market town of St. Albans. The First Battle of St. Albans was less of a grand battle and more of a violent, bloody brawl that erupted in the town streets. But its consequences were immense. The Lancastrian forces were caught completely off guard and quickly routed. Their leader, Margaret's key ally, the Duke of Somerset, was cornered and killed in the brutal fighting. Most significantly, the victorious Yorkists found King Henry sitting quietly and bewildered in his tent. Once again, the King of England had become their prisoner. For Margaret, who was not at the battle, the news was devastating. Her chief ally was dead, her husband was a captive, and her enemies were now in total control of the kingdom. Fearing for her own life and, above all, the life of her young son, she fled. The first blood had been spilt in the dynastic conflict that would one day be known as the Wars of the Roses. The queen was now a fugitive, but her resolve had only hardened into something akin to tempered steel. She had lost the first round, but the war for her son's crown had just begun. In the immediate aftermath of St. Albans, Richard of York was once again named protector of the realm. But Margaret, though defeated and on the run, was far from broken. From her new base of operations in the Midlands, she became the beating heart and strategic mind of the Lancastrian resistance. She was no longer simply a queen consort fighting from the shadows. She was now a party leader, a master strategist, and a field commander. She traveled tirelessly across the country, raising money, gathering allies, and building a new army from the ashes of her defeat. She filled the vacuum of leadership left by her husband's weakness, becoming the fierce, living embodiment of the Lancastrian cause. For 4 tense years, a fragile, uneasy peace held, but the kingdom was dangerously divided into 2 heavily armed camps. Margaret's moment for revenge finally came in 1459. After skillfully goading the Yorkists into another confrontation, her new and improved Lancastrian army won a decisive, crushing victory at the Battle of Ludford Bridge. This time, it was the Yorkist leaders who were forced to flee for their lives. York escaped to the safety of Ireland, while the Earl of Warwick and York's eldest son, a young man named Edward, Earl of March, fled to Calais. Margaret, now in a position of supreme power, showed absolutely no mercy. She pushed for a parliament to be held in Coventry, a session stacked with her supporters that would later be known as the Parliament of Devils. This parliament declared the exiled Yorkist lords traitors, passing acts of attainder that stripped them of all their lands, titles, and inheritances. By outlawing them and disinheriting their heirs, she had escalated the conflict beyond politics. She had made it a fight to the death. The following year, the Yorkists struck back. Invading England from Calais, they captured King Henry yet again at the Battle of Northampton in July 1460. With the king his prisoner, Richard of York returned from Ireland, and emboldened by this dramatic reversal of fortune, he finally made his ultimate move. He marched into Parliament in London, strode to the empty throne, and placed his hand upon it. A clear, unambiguous statement of his intention to be king. But even his own Yorkist allies balked at the idea of deposing God's anointed king. A tense compromise was hammered out, the Act of Accord. This act stated that Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life, but his own son, Prince Edward, would be disinherited. The crown would instead pass to the Duke of York and his heirs. For Margaret, hearing this news from her refuge in the north, this was an abomination. It was a violation of God's law and man's law. It was the one thing she could never, ever accept, the theft of her son's sacred birthright. Her response was immediate, and it was furious. She summoned the loyal Lancastrian nobility of the north, and by December 1460, she had assembled a formidable army in Yorkshire ready to fight for her son. Richard of York, fatally underestimating her strength and her fury, marched north to confront her. On December 30th, outside his own castle at Wakefield, Margaret's forces ambushed and completely destroyed the Yorkist army. The Duke of York himself was slain in the battle. Margaret's vengeance was as swift as it was brutal. York's head, along with those of his son Edmund and the Earl of Salisbury, was impaled on a spike above the gates of the city of York. In a final, mocking gesture, a paper crown was placed on his severed head. With her greatest enemy dead, Margaret marched south, her northern army swelling in numbers as it went. She defeated the Earl of Warwick at the Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461, and, in a moment of supreme, emotional triumph, was finally reunited with her husband, King Henry. She was at the absolute zenith of her power, having avenged her earlier defeats with stunning ferocity. The road to London, and what she hoped would be the final destruction of the Yorkist cause, seemed wide open before her. Margaret had won the battles, but in a cruel twist of fate, she was about to lose the war. The reputation of her northern army had marched ahead of her. Tales, likely exaggerated by Yorkist propaganda but containing a grain of truth, of looting and pillaging by her undisciplined forces spread like wildfire through the south, terrifying the populace. The city of London, wealthy, powerful, and fiercely protective of its own interests, feared being sacked. When Margaret's triumphant army approached the capital, the city fathers made a fateful decision. They barred the gates, refusing her entry. That hesitation was fatal. It gave the shattered Yorkist cause a crucial, priceless window of opportunity to regroup. Richard of York was dead, but his claim, and his burning desire for vengeance, had passed to his eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. Now 18 years old, Edward was everything Henry VI was not. He was tall, charismatic, handsome, and a brilliant and ruthless military commander. While Margaret was stalled outside London's walls, Edward marched his own forces into the city to a hero's welcome. On March 4, 1461, he was proclaimed King Edward IV by the people of London and a council of lords. England now had two kings, and only one of them could survive. Edward, wasting no time, moved north immediately to confront the Lancastrian army. On March 29, 1461, on a windswept, snowy plateau near the small village of Towton, the two largest armies ever assembled on English soil met in what would become a legend of horror. The Battle of Towton was a slaughter on an unprecedented scale, the single bloodiest and largest battle ever fought in England. For hours, in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, the two sides hacked each other to pieces in a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. Eventually, the Lancastrian line, exhausted and blinded by the snow, broke. The retreat turned into a panicked rout. Thousands were killed as they fled, cut down from behind, or drowned in the freezing river, which was said to have run red with blood for days. The Lancastrian army was not just defeated, it was utterly annihilated. Contemporary chronicles report as many as 28,000 casualties. For Margaret, who was waiting with Henry at York when the catastrophic news arrived, it was a disaster beyond all imagination. Her cause was shattered, her army destroyed. With the new King Edward IV and his victorious forces in hot pursuit, she took her husband and her son and fled once more, this time across the border into Scotland, a fugitive queen with nothing left but her own indomitable, unbreakable will. The years that followed were a staggering testament to Margaret's incredible, almost superhuman perseverance. From the relative safety of Scotland, she sailed to France in 1462, transforming herself from a warrior queen into a tireless diplomat for her son's cause. She became a constant, pleading presence at the French court, a queen in exile, desperately trying to beg, borrow, or bargain for money and troops to launch another invasion of England. For 9 long, grinding years, she schemed and she plotted, her small court in exile a magnet for any disaffected Lancastrians who still dared to dream of a restoration. She was relentless, refusing to give up hope even when her husband, Henry, was captured by Yorkist agents in 1465 and imprisoned in the grim confines of the Tower of London. The fight, she knew, was no longer for him. It was now solely and completely for her son, Edward, who was growing from a boy into a young man at her side. Then, in 1470, an astonishing, almost unbelievable opportunity presented itself. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man they called the Kingmaker, the architect of the Yorkist victory, the man who had done more than anyone to put Edward IV on the throne, had a spectacular and bitter falling out with the king he had created. Furious at Edward's secret marriage to the commoner Elizabeth Woodville and his own rapidly waning influence at court, Warwick fled to France, plotting rebellion. There, in a stunning, whiplash-inducing reversal of alliances, King Louis XI of France, a master of political manipulation, brokered a reconciliation between the two bitterest enemies imaginable, Margaret of Anjou and the Earl of Warwick. It reportedly took 15 days of tense, agonizing negotiations to persuade Margaret to even consider joining forces with the man she blamed for years of suffering, exile, and the loss of her kingdom. But they shared a powerful common enemy in Edward IV. They sealed their unholy, pragmatic alliance in the most traditional way possible. Margaret's 17-year-old son, Edward of Westminster, was betrothed to Warwick's younger daughter, and Neville. The plan they hatched was audacious to the point of madness. Warwick would invade England with a small force, depose Edward IV, and restore Henry VI to the throne. Once the kingdom was secure, Margaret and her son, the Prince of Wales, would follow with a larger army. In the autumn of 1470, the plan worked with breathtaking, shocking success. Warwick landed in England. Edward IV was caught completely by surprise and forced to flee to Burgundy, and the Kingmaker marched triumphantly into London. He strode to the Tower, freed a bewildered and vacant Henry VI from his cell, and placed him back on the throne. The readoption of Henry VI was complete. In France, Margaret prepared to sail for home, surely believing her long, bitter, soul-crushing struggle was finally over. Victory, so close she could taste it, was snatched from her grasp by the cruelest twists of fate. As Margaret and her son prepared to sail for England, their fleet was held captive in the French harbor for weeks on end by relentless, impassable storms. That delay, a matter of mere chance and weather, proved fatal. It gave the exiled Edward IV just enough time to gather his own forces, hire foreign mercenaries, and launch his own daring return to England. Margaret and Prince Edward finally landed at Weymouth on April 14, 1471. As she stepped onto English soil for what she believed would be her triumphant return, she was met with the worst possible news imaginable. On that very same day, Edward IV had confronted and killed the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. Her champion was dead. Her entire strategy was in ruins. Her advisors were thrown into chaos, divided on what to do. Some urged her to immediately turn back, to return to the safety of France. But her son Edward, now 17 years old, handsome, proud, and desperate to prove himself, insisted they fight on. Driven by a mother's desperate hope and a prince's tragic pride, Margaret led her exhausted and demoralized army on a forced march north, trying to cross the River Severn to join with loyal Lancastrian forces from Wales. But Edward IV's army was fast, fresh, and relentless, shadowing their every move. On May 4, 1471, Edward intercepted them at Tewkesbury and forced them into a final, desperate battle. The Battle of Tewkesbury was the final, tragic end of the Lancastrian dream. Their tired, outnumbered army was systematically outmaneuvered and destroyed. In the chaos of the rout that followed, the absolute worst of all Margaret's fears came to pass. Her son, Edward of Westminster, the sole focus of her life, the very reason for her 30-year struggle, was killed. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some say he was slain in the heat of the fighting, others that he was captured and executed afterward by the Duke of Clarence. But the result was the same. He was the only Prince of Wales in English history to ever die in battle. The cause for which Margaret had fought so long, so hard, and so ruthlessly, died with him on that bloody field. With her son's death, Margaret's formidable spirit was completely and utterly broken. The fearsome she-wolf, the indomitable warrior queen, was gone. In her place was a grieving, empty shell of a woman. She was found a few days after the battle, hiding in a poor religious house, and taken prisoner. She was then paraded through the streets of London in Edward IV's victory procession, a final, crushing humiliation for the defeated queen. A few weeks later, her husband met his own end. On the night of May 21, 1471, Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official cause was melancholy, but it is almost certain that he was murdered on the orders of Edward IV to extinguish the last, flickering flame of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret was now a widow and childless, her entire family and her political world erased from existence. She remained a prisoner in England for 5 long years, held first at Wallingford Castle and then in the custody of her former lady-in-waiting. She was no longer a political threat, just a tragic, walking relic of a bygone war. Finally, in 1475, her cousin, King Louis XI of France, paid a handsome ransom for her release. In exchange, Margaret was forced to formally renounce all of her claims to the English throne and to cede her own French inheritance to him. Margaret of Anjou returned to France, the land of her birth, but not in triumph. She lived out her final years as a poor relation of the French king, residing in a small castle in her ancestral home of Anjou. Impoverished, powerless, and largely forgotten, she died on August 25, 1482, at the age of just 52. She was buried next to her parents in Angers Cathedral, but even in death, she found no peace. It is believed her remains were scattered by angry revolutionaries during the French Revolution, though like many details of her life, this final desecration is not fully documented. So, how should we remember this extraordinary queen? Is she the she-wolf of France, the term of abuse coined by her enemies and forever immortalized by Shakespeare, who painted her as a cruel, vengeful, and adulterous monster? Was she a meddling foreign woman whose own ambition and ruthlessness plunged England into the chaos of a bloody civil war? Or was she something far more complex? Was she a product of her brutal circumstances? A woman of valiant courage and undaunted spirit, as even one of her contemporary critics described her, who was thrust into an impossible situation. Was she a loyal wife forced to rule for a husband whose mind had tragically failed him? And above all, was she a mother, driven by the fierce, primal, and unshakable instinct to protect her child's inheritance against those who would steal it? Her actions were often ruthless, her leadership unforgiving. She sent men to their deaths, she ordered executions, and she waged war with a ferocity that shocked her contemporaries. But she did so in an age of unimaginable brutality, fighting for a cause she believed in with every single fiber of her being. Margaret of Anjou was not a simple villain, nor was she a blameless heroine. She was a queen who, when faced with her king's madness and a kingdom collapsing into war, refused to be a passive victim. She chose to fight, and in doing so, she became one of the most complex, formidable, and unforgettable figures to ever wear the crown of England. Here at Chronicles of Old Tales, we believe history is never simple. If you found this story of England's fiercest queen compelling, make sure you subscribe and click that bell icon for more stories about the forgotten, misunderstood, and controversial figures of the past. And now we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments. After hearing her story, do you see Margaret of Anjou as a villain, a hero, or something far more complicated? We'd love to hear your thoughts.